Hey folks, Amanda here. Just a quick heads up that from time to time, the Survivor's Guide to Thriving podcast does include some adult language. So if you've got kids with you, you may just want to hold on to this episode to listen to a little later. Enjoy! Welcome back to the Survivor's Guide to Thriving podcast, the show for people who are ready to break out of survival mode in order to build a truly thriving life. I'm Amanda Sollman, and along with Mark Jewell and the rest of my team here at Mark Jewell Speaking and Training, we break down common roadblocks that keep people stuck surviving and share ideas to help you thrive each and every day. One of our missions here at MJST is to challenge people to think differently about life and work. Does it have to look the way it's always looked? Or is there a different way? Is there an evolution? Is there something we can change to make life work better and work better? And I think undoubtedly one of the areas of conversation that falls under that umbrella is the idea of remote work. Now, I know remote working may not be for everybody, both on the employee side and on the company side, but it's definitely something that I think folks and companies and leadership are thinking more and more about. Personally, between my last job and my current job, I have been working remotely for about 4 years, and I would have a really hard time going back to working in an office. That's not to say that I wouldn't, if something ever really struck my fancy or I was really passionate about. But there definitely is there's an element of remote working that just works for me, and I know works for other people. In my experience, I have worked both in a setting where I was one of just a handful of remote workers, where the bulk of the team worked out of a centralized office, but I worked from home. And then in my current role here with MJST, our whole team is remote. So everybody works from home. And there's definitely pros and cons, right? And there's definitely things to think about. But working remotely is one of those things that I just encourage companies, leadership to not just dismiss out of hand just because you've never done it before. I have run into that before. And so I think it's something that we should at least be considering. Because here's the reality, right? Is this is not just something I benefit from. And it's not just something, fancy people at startups or in Silicon Valley or these digital nomads who work as they travel around the world, right? It's not just for a specific set of people. There was an article that Gallup put out last October that I will link to in the show notes, where they actually found that 51% of employees say they would change jobs for flex time, and 35% say they would change jobs for a flexible working location. Right now, obviously, flex time is a little different idea, but the reality is employees today are looking for flexibility. They're looking for ways to make their job and their life work together. And those of you who have worked with us and listened to this podcast for a while know, right, here at MJST, we are very passionate about helping people develop a whole life approach, right? You're not one person when you're at work and one person when you're at home. This is just one big life that we are all trying to make work together. And remote working or flex time, those are all things that we have to at least be thinking about and take into consideration. So for today's episode, I want to dive into a couple of things. So one, I want to start out looking at some observations I have had of working remotely, both on the employee side, but also as someone who has managed a team in a remote working setting. And I want to kind of look at some of those. And then I want to share with you a few of my tips for working remotely. Obviously, everybody works a little different differently, but I just kind of want to share with you some of what has worked for me, or things that I've had to consider as I've learned how to shift out of a more traditional office-based setting and into a remote working setting, working from my house. And so first things first, let's talk about some things that I've observed as I've shifted into being a remote worker. And that is that here's number one. I have talked to companies who, the minute you mention remote working, the walls go up, right? Nope, we don't do that here. And I understand, right? I said earlier, it's not something that works for everybody, and that's totally fine. But one thing I have noticed is that when there is like an immediate opposition to even considering working from home or providing, some flexibility in the location from where employees work from, that reaction is often rooted in fear or in a lack of trust in their employees. Okay, so one of the things that I hear is, well, how will I know if people are working? Right? How will I know if I'm not seeing my employee at their desk every day? How will I know they're doing something? The other question that I hear people ask in this situation is, but what will everyone else think? Right? What will everyone else think if that person gets to work from home and they don't? And if you take a step back and think about those two reactions, how will I know they're working? What will the other staff think? It's really rooted in a lack of trust and fear, right? I don't trust my employee to get work done without a babysitter, right? I don't trust people to get work done if I'm not there checking in on them. Right? I don't trust people if I can't see them, that they're not whatever, watching TV, playing with their dog, I don't know what, right? And so if that is your first reaction, I just want you to pause and think, what is it about your culture and your relationship with your employees that is creating that lack of trust? Because chances are that lack of trust is there whether they're in your office or not in your office. And the fact that they're in the office is just covering it up, right? So consider, where might I not be trusting my employees? And what does that tell me, right? Do I need to spend more time coaching? Do I need to coach myself to take a step back and really let people own the work that they are doing? How would I measure progress and productivity if I wasn't standing there with them every day? Right? Because the reality is, results speak for themselves, right? If the work is getting done, it shouldn't matter where it's happening, right? You don't have to babysit someone to know whether or not work's getting done. And I'm sure many of you are like me in that lots of people who you do see every day who still aren't productive, right? Your presence and you seeing them really isn't the differentiating factor. And so question, if my first reaction to even thinking about remote working is, how will I know if they're getting something done? Take a step back and evaluate that lack of trust in your employees. Okay. And if you think the other question that I brought up, what will the other people think? They're going to be mad if one employee is working from home and they're not. Again, what are you afraid of? Are you afraid of having hard conversations? Are you afraid of defending your decision? Right? If an employee has earned the ability to work from home and you trust them to get their job done, then you should have no problem telling your other staff members why you made that decision, why you made that allowance. So if you are not letting people work from home, or you're not even considering remote working because you don't want to have a tough conversation with somebody about why one employee has earned that right and another hasn't, again, might be time to take a look in the mirror. In answer to this observation, right? This observation that, oh my gosh, immediate opposition to the idea of remote working, I like to challenge managers to play the what if game. And so how I describe the what if game is that, what if you were to let somebody work from home? How might that work? What conversations would you have to have? What boundaries would you have to put in place? What standards of communication would you require? What would be the things that would earn someone the right to work from home, right? And so instead of just out of hand going, nope, we don't do that here, consider, well, what if we did do that here? What could that look like? Because what happens is we start to realize there are solutions to this challenge, or there are solutions to this problem. And I don't even know that it's a problem, but the reality is there are solutions out there that if we just immediately say, nope, we don't do that, we're shutting ourselves off to creativity and brainstorming and problem solving that is available to us. So if you find yourself in that bucket, and again, there's no judgment. If this is not something that works for your organization, that's fine. But what if it was? Right? Knowing that your employees are looking for flexibility, what could it look like? Okay. Another observation that I have made about working remotely is that leading and hiring for a remote team is different. Right? I think there would have been a time in this journey where I said, nope, it can be for anybody, everything, anybody can work from home. And I have sort of shifted my thinking on that. Just as I've had more of the experience from the other side of the table as a leader, as a manager, as a supervisor. On the leadership side of it, I will say that I think hiring for a remote team, especially when you're either fully remote or mostly remote, is that I find that we tend to gravitate more towards those higher experienced, self-led employees, right? And it's great. Like if you look at our team here at MJST, pretty much everybody on our team thus far has experience. They're self-driven, self-motivated. They know what they need to get done. They take charge. They have initiative, right? And we don't have to babysit anybody, right? We trust each other to get done what needs to be done. And if there's a delay or if something's not happening, we have conversations about that because we judge productivity and performance based on the results we're putting out. It has to be that way when you're in a remote team because you can't judge by time spent or how long I see you sitting at your desk or something like that. And so when we're hiring, we definitely tend to gravitate towards those people because there's a little less training involved, right? There's a little less hand-holding. There's a little less babysitting. And so I just see that. On the flip side, I think we also tend to gravitate towards more hands-off management styles, right? Because I can't be there every day with you. I can't be sitting next to you asking you how you're doing or, micromanaging the project you're working on, like I might do if I was in an office and I could just swing by your cube every so often, which, has its pros and cons too. And so if you are considering allowing employees to work from home or you want to work from home, I just want to highlight how important it is to practice some of those managing up skills that we talked about in episode 101, because you're not going to have someone there watching your body language, watching your face, kind of curious or always knowing if you're getting what you need in terms of support. And so that communication channel has to be really, really important. I also think, though, if you are considering hiring very junior people, that's something that we've got to think long and hard about how that might work in a remote setting. I know that's something that we're really talking about here at MJST as we look to where our team expands over the next few years. We might want to bring in some more junior people, and yet we don't have a centralized office to train people into, or, we're not there with them every day, making sure they understand what their job is and understand what they need to be doing, or to ask them what sort of support and feedback they need. And so, that there just might be a different dynamic there, working with junior people, especially those right out of college who have maybe not had a ton of work experience yet. I think most of us understand, there's a lot of maturity and growth that happens over the first 3, 5, 7 years of your career, that I think does make remote working a little easier. That if you're hiring junior people, you have to think through that a little bit differently. I think you also have to think through that a little bit differently about what type of manager you are, right? If you understand your strengths and they are, hands off and not the person to be there guiding someone every step of the way, hiring a junior person in a remote work setting may not be the thing for you, because you have to put in more effort to jump on Zoom or to give them a call or to send them a text, right? Because they're not there in front of you every day. And so I also think it takes getting real with yourself as a manager and what your skills are and what your strengths are and what your communication style is, to ask yourself, is this the best fit for our team if we have a lot of junior staffers? So again, just something to think about. I mentioned it as I was sort of talking about communication in a management context, but I just want to highlight that another key observation of working remotely is that clarity becomes absolutely critical in a remote working setting. The clarity in your communication, clarity in your direction is not optional when it comes to having people who work from home or work from wherever they work, right? There's just too much room for error if we're not communicating very clearly, right? It's something that in an office setting can somewhat be band-aided over, right? If we're not communicating clearly and people have questions, it's not hard to walk down the hallway and knock on someone's door. It's not hard to swing past somebody's cubicle. It's not hard to catch somebody, at the coffee pot and ask them questions. When you're working remotely, all of those little things have to be purposeful. Right? You have to make time for them. You have to pick up the phone. You have to send the text. You have to do the group chat. You have to send the email. You have to do whatever it is to make sure that people are clear on what you need from them, what questions they have, what questions you have. And it cannot be something that is optional. And so part of that is just clarity around directions, around execution on any given day. I also think there needs to be clarity around what's working and what's not working, right? So, in my previous job, where I was one of just a small handful of people working remotely at the time, I'm not sure how many people they have who work from home today, but at the time there weren't a ton of us. And so there were situations where we'd have a big group kickoff meeting and I would be on speakerphone, but the way the room was or the way the speakerphone was, I would have a hard time hearing people, right? So if they met in a big conference room, I might be able to hear the people closest to the phone speaker, but not super far away on either end of the big boardroom table. And so it became really critical for me to speak up and say, hey, I understand that we're doing conference calls in this room. I can't hear you guys. So we either need to figure out a better conference phone system where the speakers work a little better or differently, or we need to move to a different room where I can hear people more effectively, whatever the solution is. But I had to be really clear, like, hey, the way we're doing this is not working. And so in order for me to be most effective at my job, we've got to make some tweaks, right? And they were totally cool with that because they had agreed to allowing me to work remotely. And so that meant that we might have to tweak some things to make that work most effectively for people on both sides. I did the same thing in asking for us to start switching from just a phone conference call to video chat, right? It's really hard to read tone, to read, facial expressions if you've only got audio. And sometimes those are the really important things in a meeting. And so that was another thing that I said, hey, this isn't working. Can we do XYZ? And so that is some of the conversations around clarity as well that need to be happening. Are the folks in the office getting what they need from the remote work team? And is the remote work team getting what they need from the folks in the office? And if not, we get to have lots of ongoing conversations about how we keep evolving that to make sure that everybody is able to bring the most amount of value possible. Okay. And before I move on from this topic of clarity, I want to highlight one more area that I think is really important. If you are not a fully remote team, or if not everyone is given the privilege of working from home or having flex time or whatever your policy for flexibility is, if that is not available to every single person in your organization, you get to create clarity around what makes some people eligible for that and what does not make other people eligible for that, right? No, I get it, right? Remote working very much can be something that people earn over time. I understand that, right? And that might be a good, evolution of your workplace culture around flexibility and working location. But if the waters are muddy around who gets it and who doesn't, I can guarantee you that there will be some resentment, some anger, some irritation somewhere along the way, right? It's what we talked about earlier. Those are those tough conversations that people want to avoid. So they just say, nope, nobody's working remotely, which I don't know in some situations is the best solution either. But again, if this is not something that's extended to everyone, you get to be super clear as a leader, as the manager, around what makes some people eligible for it and what makes others not. So is it tenure with the company? Is it competency that someone has demonstrated? Is it, when you do A, B, and C, then you are eligible to work from home, and that's something we review as a manager-employee pair or whatever that is. Just be super clear about it, because I think if there is nuance, right? If there's, she gets to work from home because our boss just likes her better or whatnot, or if there doesn't just seem to be consistency between who can and who can't, that can cause issues, right? And so again, clarity is power. Help people clearly understand how this might be something that they are eligible for, either now or in the future, right? It doesn't have to be something you get from day one. It might be something in 6 months or 2 years or 5 years or whatever that we start to talk about what's possible. Okay. The fourth observation that I want to share with you, and in my notes I wrote truth bomb. If you are an organization that has a field-based sales team, right? If you're in agriculture, which I know a lot of our clients are, but other industries potentially as well. But if you're a business or an organization that has a field-based sales team, I'm sorry to break it to you, you already have remote workers, right? I think of my husband who is a salesman for a seed company, and he has his company pickup truck and he's out on the road talking to customers. But when he's doing quote unquote office work, he's at home in our spare bedroom at his laptop getting that done, right? And so there are a lot of companies I've run into who will say, yeah, we don't do remote work. And then I laugh because I know they have field-based sales folks. And so what they actually meant is, we don't do remote work for certain types of people, okay, or certain types of roles. And now for some, like I totally get that, right? There are certain jobs in certain organizations, right? This is really simplified, but I think of like in a factory or in a warehouse or, I keep going back to agriculture, the industry we work in a lot. If you're out in the feed mill, those are jobs you can't do from home, right? I can't load boxes for customers at home. I can't run the line to build this thing from home. I can't make feed from home. Like, I get it, right? I'm not trying to make this sound as though like it's available to anybody, no matter what you do. That's silly. But there are other jobs that I think we often say, yeah, we don't do remote work. And it's because we've separated, well, there's office jobs and then there's sales jobs, right? And they're different. And so again, I would just really challenge you to question that. Because to me, that goes back to number one of either a lack of trust or a fear of trying to figure out how it could work for other people, especially as more of our work takes place on a computer or on a phone. It's just something to think about. I'm just challenging you to consider, again, what could it look like? And if you have a field-based sales team and you have said in the past, we don't do remote work, I'm just checking you, right? Like just question that and just, hey, let's be honest with ourselves. It's not that we don't do remote work. It's that we just don't do remote work for certain positions. And that's the actual truth. Okay. And then the final observation that I want to make here is that if you are a manager who finds yourself wary of offering remote work or offering flexibility in whatever way that looks like, I might challenge you to challenge yourself to think about, what could I gain by offering remote working opportunities versus what might I lose? Now, I think a lot of us, and I think it comes from that scarcity mindset, that fear of change. I think a lot of us, when we think about something like remote work or offering flex time, we think about what we're going to lose. And I just want to challenge you, what could you gain? Okay. Now, one of the biggest things that I think an organization could gain by allowing for remote work is access to talent, right? And again, and I keep saying it, but I'll say it again, it does depend on what the role is, what the job is. But I think there are a lot of jobs where, the best employee for that role may not live where your company is based. Right? I think that's really what the company I used to work for, they thought is, when my husband accepted a job back in Michigan and I had been in Minnesota, they said, just because she's moving to Michigan doesn't mean she's not still the best person for the job. And so that allowed them, and I'm not trying to toot my own horn or anything like that. I realize maybe it comes off that way, but they said, it's important for us to hold on to this talent. And so we're going to find a way to make this work. And I think there are roles and jobs in other organizations where it's the same thing, right? The person who might be best for that role you're trying to fill might be 2 hours away or a state away or whatnot. And instead of saying, well, if you can't move here, then I guess you can't work here. If we really think that person's the best one for the job, let's figure out how to make it work, because we're all about having the most amount of value and bringing the most amount of value. And that means having the best talent and the best people in the jobs that we're hiring for. So that's just something to consider. If you're really struggling with talent acquisition or talent retention, consider, could remote working open you up to a pool of talent that you had never thought about before? Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing I have noticed is I think remote working can open you up to a larger footprint of impact. So just for example, as someone who is active in agriculture and in the agriculture industry here in Michigan, I have connections and networks to people that, Mark might not have, or John or Wade might not have living out in Nebraska, and vice versa. They know lots of people that I don't know. And so by allowing our team to cover a wider geographical area, we're actually able to tap into business opportunities that we might not even be aware of otherwise. This is the same when I worked in my previous role. We ended up doing some business for some people here I knew in Michigan that if I had still been based out of Minnesota, I wouldn't have been involved in the side conversations or whatnot that made those connections of mine think of me and think of my company. And so that might be something too, depending on the work you do. Remote working could allow you to cover a wider footprint. And then the last thing that I really think remote working allows companies to gain, and again, I'm speaking on this one even more so specifically to those companies who serve agriculture. It is my belief, and I don't know that it's a widespread belief, but it is a belief of mine that remote working could be one of the things that allows people to remain in or return to rural communities in a way that has not been as accessible in the past, right? There's a number of jobs, and again, I'll just use mine. So I started my career in advertising. If you wanted to work in advertising on any amount of scale, you weren't going to do that in small town Michigan, right? That opportunity just wasn't available to me. I was going to have to go to a larger city, right? Where there were advertising agencies and marketing agencies and those sorts of things, right? But with remote working, I was able to both work for that big city ad agency and live in my rural community. And trust me, I'm not trying to gloss over the challenges of internet access and cell phone service access out in what feels like the middle of nowhere sometimes. Like, I know that's a real challenge. But for those of us who are passionate about rural America, I actually think considering remote working is something that could help people reinvest in some of those communities, right? Because instead of going to the job comes to you, right? So those are some of my observations over the last 4 years of working remotely, talking to companies about remote working, and really considering what does the ability to work from home look like in my career path, right? And so now that you've kind of gotten some of my hot takes there on remote working and some of my opinions, I want to share with you just a few tips that I think are really critical if you do decide to think about or move forward with some sort of remote working arrangement. Okay. So the first tip that I would offer you that I think is really critical, and no matter who you talk to who works remotely, I think they would agree with this, is that you have to find the communication channels that work for you and work for your team. Remember, I said clarity is not optional when it comes to working remotely, and therefore you have to find the tools that work for you and your team. Okay, so for our team, we do a lot with, your traditional stuff, right? Email, phone calls. We're also big on group texts, and we use Zoom, video conferencing. And so, for a quick question here or there, somebody might call me, but a lot of times if we want to have kind of a brainstorming sesh last minute, I might shoot Christina a text and say, hey, can you jump on Zoom for 15, 20 minutes? Or I might say, hey, Mark, I'm really struggling with this thing. Are you available to jump on Zoom and just talk it through, right? And so for us, that's been critical. It also, I would highly recommend video conferencing however you do it, whether that's through a WebEx, or I think Adobe has some video conferencing software, Zoom, GoToMeeting, whatever works for you. But I do think that video element becomes really important, right? Because I'm going to talk about this more in some of the other tips, but you can feel a sense of disconnection when you're working solo. Now, there's a lot of benefits, right? I will tell you, I am 10 times more efficient at home than I am in an office any given day. But sometimes you lose that people connection when you work from home, and so having at least video really does help. Okay. So tip number 1, find the communication channels that work for you and your team and actually use them. Just before I move on, some other things that I know people use are things like Slack. I've had a harder time getting into that one, but I do know for a lot of remote teams, they really like Slack as both a chat and transferring of documents, those sorts of things. The second tip that I would offer is push for the communication you need. And I won't share, I already shared this story, but this goes back to where I was talking about, I couldn't hear on the big conference call between my office-based team and my remote-based team, or I needed to have that video so that I could read facial cues and read the nonverbals that way. And so it becomes really important, if you're working remotely, you can't just sit back and hope that they can read your mind for what they need or what you need. Because honestly, like for your office-based team, if they haven't worked remotely, they don't know what you need. So you have to ask for that. Vice versa, if you are on the office-based team and you've got somebody working remotely, instead of getting irritated that you aren't hearing from them or whatnot, make sure you're pushing for the type of communication you need. So to say, hey, I know you're working from home, but we need to touch base at least once a week so that I know kind of what you're working on this week. I can ask any questions, get any clarity, right? Whatever it is, you can ask for what you need as well. This is two-way dialogue. This is us working together to make a situation effective. Okay. Tip number 3, create face-to-face time with your team. Okay. So here at the MJST team, we have been better at this and worse at this at different times. And I think obviously the Nebraska-based crew tends to see each other a little more frequently just because of proximity. But we have started to move towards at least quarterly getting the whole team together. Now, for us, that's been in Omaha, where kind of most of the team is at, but that could be somewhere else in the future too. We might do a retreat or a meeting up here in Michigan at some point, or up in Minnesota where John is at, or heck, maybe one of these times we'll all just go somewhere warmer when it's cold out. Who knows what that might look like? But that face-to-face time is really critical because I think one of the things that people complain about or is one of the justifications for not doing remote work is that, having that critical or having that face-to-face small talk, shooting the shit type dynamic is important. And I think it is important. I think it's important to the work. I think it's part of what helps build trust between people. There's always that running joke that more work gets done at the bar than at the office sometimes. And I do believe that there is truth to that because it's important to create time for team members to sort of let their guard down and just talk and connect. And that's no different when you've got a remote team. And so I will say if you are mixed where you've got office and remote, or maybe you've got mostly office and just a few remote, make sure that you are allocating time and resources to bringing those remote people into the office from time to time. I've seen it work different ways. When I was working remotely, my manager really wanted to make sure I was in the office at least once a month. So, I would usually book a 3 to 4 day trip back to Minnesota once a month to get that face-to-face time with folks. And I would schedule lots of meetings, and I'd also schedule lots of happy hours and dinners so I could have that personal one-on-one time. I've also seen managers who have remote workers who, they're more comfortable with every other month or once a quarter. It just sort of depends. But don't leave your remote workers out on an island. Make sure that they know it's okay for them to come back to the office and have that connection, that personal time to bond with their team. Because honestly, that's just as critical sometimes as the work that you're doing. Okay. Tip number 4, and this is specifically for those of you who work from home or want to work from home. It is really important that you take breaks and create boundaries. So I don't think we notice when we work in an office how often we take breaks just by nature of being surrounded by other people and other types of resources, right? So maybe I have somebody stop by my cube and ask me how my weekend was. Or maybe I just go out to lunch with some coworkers. Or heck, we're just, warming up our lunch in the kitchen and we stand and talk for some time, right? Those little moments are very organic when you are in a formal office setting. When you work from home, it is very easy, speaking from experience, to sit at your computer without moving for 4 hours straight. Been there, done that. Don't recommend it. Once again, I said, right, I'm super productive when I work from home. There's less interruptions, less side chat, which I know some people are like, man, if I could get rid of the side conversations, that'd be great. But again, pros and cons, right? And so it is very important for you to take breaks throughout the day and not just kind of get sucked into your computer or sucked into whatever you're doing for hours on end. This is also where my Apple Watch becomes really valuable, or when I had a Fitbit, did the same thing where it would bug me once an hour to get up out of my chair. You realize how sedentary you are when you work from home and there's no one to interrupt you. So that's part of this tip. And the other part is create boundaries. This one has not affected me as much, but I know I have some other friends who work remotely that have really had to work through this. Figure out when your workday takes place and follow that. Right? So if you say I'm at my desk by 8 and I'm done working by 5, cool. If that allows you to create that time for your family in the evening, awesome. I know Mark, for example, 5 to 8 o'clock is his family time, right? Depending on what they've got going on. Obviously, maybe after that, they're putting kids together or kids to bed and that sort of thing. But there's no work happening in that time. That's family time. And so that boundary has been set. For other people, maybe it's more like, I work from, like 7 to noon. Then I do some other things. And then maybe I work from like 1 or 2 to 6 or 7, right? Like they might have a more flexible work schedule. We have a former client and friend of ours who he is a night owl. And so he will do a ton of work from like 8 o'clock at night until like 1 in the morning. And cool, would not work for me, but if that works for you, awesome. But what I kind of want to leave you with here is boundaries become really important. Now, to some extent, right, this is true even if you have an office job. How many of you leave the office, drive home, and are back on your computer or back on your phone within minutes or hours of walking in the door, right? This can sneak up on us at any time, but it becomes really critical when you work remotely and your home is your office and your office is your home. Okay. Tip number 5, for those of you who work remotely or want to work remotely, it becomes really important for you to build a network. Okay. And what I mean by that is kind of to an earlier point, it can be lonely working at home by yourself. Even when you do video chat and call and text with your coworkers, there have been times where I have stopped and had the realization that I haven't left my house in 3 days, right? Like, I'm better now because I'm going to the gym more consistently. But there has been a stretch where, because I get up, get ready, sit down at my computer, my husband gets home, we make dinner, we watch TV, and we do it all again tomorrow, I pause and I'm like, wow, I haven't seen another human being except my husband and maybe the mailman or the FedEx guy in 2 or 3 days. And that's not super healthy. So, on one hand, I've done silly things like I'm going to the grocery store just so I can be around other human beings. Like I've done that. But on the flip side, having friends, if you're part of maybe a young professionals group in your area or some other sort of community organization where you can create a space for interaction with other human beings in a meaningful way, becomes really important because you're not necessarily getting that on a day-to-day basis. I also have really tried to build a network of other, for me, women who also work from home or work remotely or work on some sort of flexible schedule because they get it, right? They get what it's like to not have talked to people in a while. They get what it's like to wonder if people are judging you when you're working in your pajamas or something like that. Like they get it. And so for me, that's been really powerful, is to have a group of people who also understand. So if you're going to work remotely full-time or whatnot, consider, how do I make sure that I'm maintaining relationships that help me grow and help keep me fulfilled and connected, because my coworkers are no longer filling that maybe as much as they would in a traditional office setting. Okay. And then my final tip is practice understanding for those who don't understand. Okay. And this goes out to specifically those of you who work remotely or who would like to work remotely. This is a new way of thinking about work for a lot of people. Right? If you haven't been a field-based salesperson, if you haven't been a freelancer, if you haven't worked remotely before, this is new to you. And so that's something that I really had to learn, is there are people who won't get it. And that's okay. Right? We're not here to seek everybody's approval. We're not here to make everybody happy. But I do believe there is a middle ground. I do believe that we can bring people into some level of understanding. I also know that we can recognize that just because somebody says no to remote working today doesn't mean they'll say no to remote working forever, right? They may need to dip their toe into the water, where maybe you just work from home 1 or 2 mornings a week, right? Or maybe they try out flex time first before remote working, or something else. There's lots of different ways to slice and dice the pie. But I think it is on those of us who work remotely to practice that patience, right? Because it can be easy to get annoyed and frustrated with people who don't want to put a remote working option in place, or who don't understand why you would want that, or who don't trust us, right? It can be easy to get frustrated with that. And so I would just encourage you to practice patience and to practice understanding and to practice grace, and keep working on it, right? Keep advocating for yourself and what you need to make life work for you and your family. And people will come along the way. My experience is that, as people get used to it, it becomes less of a thing. And so it just sometimes takes time and patience on your part. So that's what I've got for you today. A few observations about working remotely, and a few tips that if that's something you want to try out in your organization or want to try out yourself, that you might just want to keep in mind. So with that, Remember, keep thinking about work differently. Keep challenging yourself to rethink the status quo. Remote working may not be the option for you, but maybe it's something else that allows you to provide more flexibility and create more blending of life and work for you. Remember, survival is dead. It's your time to thrive today. Have a great week. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode. If you like what you heard, make sure to jump over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and review. We appreciate the feedback, and it helps other people find the show. On that same note, if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to share it with a friend. As always, if you're looking for more resources to go from surviving to thriving, check out our website at www.markjeweltraining.com. That's Jewel with 2 L's. And you can find us under Mark Jewel Speaking and Training on all the major social networks. Remember, survival is dead. It's your time to thrive today. See you next week.